Relosa. Thank you so much for joining our biggest, Lamudi's biggest housing fair. And thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you for having me as I talk about Feng Shui, or the fundamentals of Feng Shui, and tips, budget-friendly tips that you can actually do to do some mitigation for your home. Okay, once again, I'm Sofia Relosa. I am a Chinese Metaphysics Consultant, and today we are going to talk about all about Feng Shui. All right. Okay, so before I actually dive in, I would like first to actually give you a slide so you better understand how to actually utilize this in your life. Okay. There you go. Okay, so here is the slides for our presentation. And basically what we're going to do, we're going to talk about the brief history of Feng Shui, what are the types of school of Feng Shui, and what are the myths of the classical and authentic Feng Shui, and what are the external forms that you should avoid as well as internal forms. All right. Now, just to give you a very brief overview of what the history of Feng Shui is all about. Feng Shui is more than 3,000 years old, and when this was actually discovered back then, this was actually kept guarded, closely guarded secret, and was only utilized by the imperial family. It was only later on when Mao Zedong that actually came into power, where this actually it became a silver lining for the art, because most of the masters had to flee to Taiwan and Hong Kong, and that's when their knowledge was actually shared to others, primarily because most of the masters had to look for masters of Feng Shui had to look for a new master, and which is why they were able to serve business owners, and in order also to thrive through the change, they had to sell their knowledge in order to produce proteges. And that's the reason why we have this, and we have more information available about Feng Shui. Now we're going to talk about briefly what Yin Feng Shui is, which is the most important Feng Shui. Yin Feng Shui is all about tombs and tombs of ancestors, or burial sites of ancestors. It's the most important Feng Shui actually. It was discovered that if your ancestors, or yes, ancestor has a very good Feng Shui for their tombstone or for their burial site, it actually affects the descendants. The auspiciousness of the positive Feng Shui of that space, it's brought to even to the living descendants. All right. And basically, to explain with you what is Feng Shui, this actually targets, basically in a nutshell or in scientific term, it targets the analogy of entropy and kinetic energy, wherein there's an energy that's coming, or which is the key flow, okay, coming from the mountain, and that is collected within the boundaries of water and spread to the wind. So basically, the key flow that we're actually trying to respect in a way, no, using Feng Shui, is actually coming from our natural environment. Now, in the entropy side of Feng Shui, in order for a space to actually get activated, yes, activated, it actually requires another form of natural energy. And what is that? Us. Okay. Basically, if we want to activate a sector, all we need to do is to stay in the sector, work in that sector, and think in that sector. That's another form to actually activate a stagnant sector. Okay. So it's us. All right. And later on, I'm going to actually lead you to the myth that we have about the classical Feng Shui. Of course, Feng Shui is not the be-all and end-all of things. At the end of the day, our behavior, okay, our goals and our aspiration, at the same time, aligned actions in order to get to our goal is required. Basically, it tells us that Feng Shui will not work if you don't know what you want. You have to actually have a goal, the right actions in order to get there. Okay, so basically what the Feng Shui is a tool, no, to guide us and help us achieve our aspirations regardless of the challenges, regardless of the adversity. It makes us win in the end. All right. Okay, so what are the common myths of Feng Shui? Now, like I mentioned a while ago, Feng Shui is all about the natural energy around us. Okay, so basically, inanimate objects such as charms are not needed to actually activate your Feng Shui. All you need is actually yourself, you know, stay in the sector, work in the sector. in order to actually activate a positive auspicious sector. Okay, so you don't need those charms, so stop spending on charms. Next is mirrors. Basically, back then, 3,000 years ago, mirrors are made out of pure metal. And metal in Feng Shui does have an effect to our environment, or actually Feng Shui. But in this case, right now, there's very minimal metal that we can find in the mirror. It actually doesn't have any effect at all, or it doesn't create any significant effect when it comes to Feng Shui. So if you wish to put as many mirrors as you want, by all means do that. It's not going to affect the Feng Shui. Next is the colors. Basically, if you have a favorite color, if you've been wanting to use this in your house, by all means do that, because colors do not affect the Feng Shui. And last but not the least is the numbers. I know we have had this superstition for quite a while, and most would say that 4 is not a good number because it sounds like death in Chinese, the Chinese language. And in this case, well, basically, based on the scriptures that we actually based our practice, or the classical Feng Shui, numbers do not affect the Feng Shui of the space. So with laying out the myths of Feng Shui, I hope that actually gives you more clarity and feel liberated and not be limited by the superstitious belief of Feng Shui. All right. Now we have the two types of Feng Shui, which is the Sanha and Sanyuan. Sanha is all about the landforms, naturally made, okay, environment, which is the mountain, the shape of the mountain, the form, how it's placed, and so on and so forth. And next is the Sanyuan. This is a formula-based, which usually has some computation. And this is what we call the flying star if you're basic, if you're familiar with Feng Shui. But basically, these are forms that we want to combine together, or layers of Feng Shui that we actually apply in order to audit a space, and before we can specifically say that the space is properly Feng Shui. Okay, so that's basically what we do. We use the layers. All right, and then from there we create a bigger perspective if your home is good Feng Shui. All right, so that's what we do. Now, the Sanyuan, this is what we call the annual flying stars. And usually what we can do if there is a negative flying star that's landed in the sector, we either avoid that sector or we put metal to cure. All right, so basically that's the general or basic information about the two types of Feng Shui. By the way, each type has its own different formulas underneath. There are different other forms that we can actually utilize, but above them, this is basically the umbrella of all other forms or formula under the Feng Shui, the art of Feng Shui. Okay. All right. So there are 4 different factors, sectors rather, important sectors that you have to remember about Feng Shui, which is the main door, the kitchen, the bedroom, and the office and the study. Because of the pandemic, it's quite common to actually have an office space at home. So you can use this as reference, whether how to actually design your office space or your study. All right. So again, but before we dive in, remember I mentioned a while ago about the forms. Basically, this is the form is the first layer when we do some assessment, and it's actually the most important. When our forms is bad, the rest of the Feng Shui is bad. So it boils down to the form. So make sure that before you actually move in, you check out first the forms, because when everything is good and perfect, even if the negative stars land in the sector, it's fine. Okay, you'll be fine. All right. The first form that I'd like you to actually avoid is having a pole, especially in front of your main door. Okay, so imagine the key flow like a water. Okay, a water form, and in order for it to flow and give you auspicious energy, it has to flow without any destruction, and the pole is definitely a destruction. Okay, so as much as possible, we don't want any obstruction or destruction with going for the key to come in the space, because especially in the main door, because the main door is the mouth of the office of the home. Now, if the key flow is already disrupted in the main door, it no longer spread inside the house. So which is why the main door is very important. Okay, next is the alley. Now this alley actually is to what causes what makes the alley a bad form. It actually suppresses the key flow. What the key flow want is for it to move meanderingly. Okay, there should be enough space for it to move around. That's not causing it to be a rushing key. Okay, now alleys on the other hand, because the key is quite suppressed, the key flow becomes a rushing key. All right, what happens to the occupants? They become overwhelmed with the too much energy that it's received within the household. So what happens? It becomes a negative effect. It brings out the negative effect. Okay, basically this can affect your the wealth of the occupants, the relationship, even the career, and even health. Okay, so as much as possible, you want to avoid alleys, especially in your main door. Okay, next is the pointed roof. Now, the pointed roof actually has negative or stronger negative effect should the flying star or the formula-based Feng Shui negative uh, a flying star lands in the sector. Once again, okay, so the ill effect of the pointed roof, okay, the pointed roof in your main door becomes stronger the moment the flying star 5, which is a formula-based Feng Shui, lands in the sector. So say for instance, the flying star 5 lands in the sector, what happens is anything that can go wrong can go wrong. So as much as possible, to avoid that from happening altogether, is we avoid having this in our main door. Now, what's the cure on the other hand if we have this and we can't move the main door, or it's much more expensive to move the main door? What we can do is plant a tree or plant as much as possible, plant a plant, and as much as possible, what we want is the plant to cover the pointed roof. Okay? All right. Next, remember that I told you about that the water is, the key flow is like a water. One of the things that he hates the most is corners. And consider corners like something that hurts them or scratches them or, yes, bruises them. Okay, so that's one of the things that they hate. So you don't want this in your main door, going in, even out. Okay, so this is one thing that you can definitely avoid. You should avoid, especially in the main door. If you have this in your current main door right now, it's best to use a different main door or a different door, just to make sure that the key flow gets to flow in meanderingly. Okay, next, of course, this is quite common sense. We don't want garbage, especially if it's not properly managed or kept. Okay, so as much as possible, we don't want this inside and even outside our space. So make sure when you're going to keep your garbage outside, it's properly managed and it's properly arranged, just to not to cause any bad feng shui. Okay, so there you go. Okay, and then next is, of course, as much as possible, especially if you're still looking, what you want from your own space is to have this in your external environment. Lush mountain, as this is where the key flows come in. The more trees the mountain has, the more auspicious the key flow is going to go inside your space. All right. Okay, so now we're moving into the internal form, which is the kitchen and the bedroom and the study. Okay, all right. So one of the things that we can, I don't know if I mentioned this a while ago, but a kitchen is basically where the health is, or the health of the occupants is. Okay, but in this case, this also includes, in this particular form, this can also affect relationship. Okay, so what we don't want is the stove beside a sink. Now, why so? Because these are two different clashing elements, water and fire. Now, in order to mitigate that, what we want is to put a plant in the middle, in between the stove and the sink. Just a living plant, by the way, living plant. Make sure that it's a living plant in between the stove and the sink. And that actually mitigates this bad form. Okay, make sure it's kept alive though. The plant is kept alive. So how big As long as it's living, it doesn't have to be very big, you know, a small one. Succulent is good. And just make sure that it's kept alive. Okay? All right. Next is stove in front of the sink. Now, with what happens if I have it, it's the same effect as the first form I showed you a while ago. It's a clashing of two distinctly different energies. So in order to mitigate this, we actually need wood. But looking at the design, we cannot put a wood in between. So what's another advice in order to solve this bad form? We either use a different sink, okay, in a different location, or we use a different stove in your dirty kitchen. Okay, just make sure that one of the energy of this space is not utilized. Okay, so you can choose wherever, just make sure that one of any of the space is not utilized, just to balance the elements or the energies of this form. Okay, next is, of course, what we want to avoid. Another, I know I specifically mentioned, no, that stove is actually the health of the occupants. And remember that I told you that key flow hates corners. Yes. Now, the fact that the corner is facing the stove, this directly affects the health of the occupants. So, but what's the best way to actually mitigate? It's either we put a plant to cover the corner, or we simply move our stove. Okay, as much as possible, we don't want our stove facing any corner, sideways or like this one. Okay, so as much as possible, no corners when it comes to the stove. Okay, so island in front of a stove is not a good design. So better if you're going to use the stove in your dirty kitchen where there's no island or anything else. Okay. Next is the island stove. Okay, island stove is quite beautiful when it comes to design. The problem is this becomes a rushing key. There's too much key flow flowing into the stove, which is not good. Again, this is another bad form that affects the health of the occupant. So best to actually transfer your stove to a wall. There is a wall in your kitchen. Make sure that you put your stove there. What it needs is a backing. Okay, just to mitigate the ill effect of the too much key flow flowing to your stove, which is illness. Okay, long-term illness. That would happen if you have a island stove. Okay. All right. Next is the bedroom. Okay, remember that I told you a while ago that corners is something that key flow hates, and as well as coal. So this is definitely not something that you don't want to have in your bedroom, primarily because pillars or corners actually suppresses the key flow. Okay, imbalances the key flow. And because of that, the occupants may have difficulty sleeping, or this may cause long-term insomnia. All right. And what happens if we have too much insomnia or lack of sleep? We end up not performing well at work and in our life because we're too tired. That's one thing that we don't want to happen. So which is why we avoid corners or pillar at all costs. Now, if say, for instance, you have this in your home, so what do? We transfer to a new home. New bedroom. Basically, that's the best way to address this corner and pillar in your bedroom. Okay, next, this is definitely one thing you want to have, is to make sure that your bed is against a wall. What the bed needs is another form of yin energy, and the wall is another form of yin energy. All right, good. Next is we don't want beam above the bed. This definitely suppresses, like I mentioned a while ago, it suppresses the key flow, and the effect is difficulty sleeping, especially for long term. And you know what happens also when we have difficulty sleeping for long term? It affects our health. So we don't want that. Okay? All right. Next, of course, is the study. The study now is very common, especially during the pandemic. Okay, so which is why we want to make sure that our study is properly feng shuied. Okay, so in this case, study below a slanted ceiling or below the stairs. what happens, no? If you have this under the slanted ceiling or below the stairs, what happens, it's hard for us to actually concentrate in this table, and we end up becoming too lazy to produce. No? And so this is not a good sign, especially if we are someone that's creative and someone that wants to produce for others. Okay, so which is why the best way to address this is we simply move the desk to the highest part of ceiling or highest ceiling part in the room. That's the best way to budget friendly way to actually address this issue. Okay, next is the window behind the desk. Okay, what happens if why is this bad feng shui? Primarily because of too much yang energy, which is the glare from the sun. And we have too much yang energy, it's hard for us to concentrate because of the glare. Okay, now there's a very minimal activity that you can do to mitigate this, which is to buy a curtain that can help reduce the glare of the sun. Okay, we don't want this to be a blackout because we don't want to fall asleep in our office. So which is why we buy a curtain or blinds that can help reduce the glare of the sun. You know, it's very minimal, budget friendly. Okay. Next, of course, is desk directly facing the door, especially if the door, the other side of the door is the main entrance, or there's too much energy activity outside the door. This becomes a rushing key. So what happens is it's hard for us to concentrate. Other than that, the moment the negative star lands in the sector, it's further aggravated. Okay, so those are, yes, the very basic forms or tips that you can actually use to make sure that your home is following proper feng shui. And I hope that you actually learned today. And if you do want to follow me in my social media, I'm available in Instagram, Sofia Relosa. I'm also in YouTube, Sofia Relosa, also on Facebook, and I also have a Facebook group that you can actually sign up to learn more and for free additional information. Thank you so much for watching me, and I hope you learned something today. Bye!